This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome acclaimed journalist Misha Glenny, presenting his new book, Nemesis, One Man and the Battle for Rio. Mr. Glenny is the author of the previous books Dark Market, McMafia, The Rebirth of History, The Fall of Yugoslavia, and The Balkans, Nationalism, War, and the Great Power, 1804 to 1999. As a BBC Central Europe correspondent, he covered the fall of communism and the wars in the former Yugoslavia, and he has been regularly consulted by the US and European governments on major policy issues. In this book, he tells us the story of Antonio Francisco Bonfim Lopes, a hard-working young father who became the king of Rocinha, the largest slum in Rio, the head of a drug cartel, and perhaps Brazil's most wanted criminal, known to all as Nem. This is a riveting account of his ruthless ascent in Rio's terrifying underworld, his sway over its anarchic outlaw culture, and his accidental fall. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Misha Glenny.
Thank you very much, Victor. Well, Brazil, what can I say? I first visited Brazil about 10 years ago, having spent most of my professional career in Eastern Europe and the Balkans in particular. But when I was working in the Balkans, I noticed during the wars in Yugoslavia the tight connections that had emerged between the politicians of the former Yugoslavia and organized crime groups. And at first, I thought that this was perhaps an anomaly restricted to the former Yugoslavia because they were in the middle of a war. But then I realized that what was happening was that Yugoslavia, a glass of wine, how splendid. Yugoslavia was, in fact, in the midst of a rapid globalization of organized crime. And Yugoslavia was the distribution hub for illicit goods and services coming from all over the world to straining to get to its biggest market, which was the European Union, which was rapidly becoming the largest consumer market in history, with a penchant for consuming drugs for its citizens wanting to sleep with women who'd been trafficked for sexual purposes, for people who wanted to smoke untaxed cigarettes, and the like. And I started looking at some of the connections between Yugoslavia and other parts of the world after the collapse of communism, and realized that organized crime had been able to exploit the mechanisms of globalization much, much faster than most other industries because it was a very flexible network. So I thought, well, this would be interesting to go around the world and have a look at how different countries were responding to the globalization of organized crime. And this was also an opportunity for me. I'd been working in the Balkans for 25 years. To be honest, the Balkans can be quite a depressing place sometimes, particularly if you've been through sort of 10, 15 years of war there. And so I was able to choose various different countries to go and visit to see how it was engaging with this new phenomenon of globalized organized crime. And one of the countries I chose to go to was Brazil. And when I went to Brazil for the first time about 10 years ago, I think I probably was subject to the same stereotypical images of Brazil that most people do. I knew quite a lot about Brazilian football soccer that is, because I come from the United Kingdom, and where obviously soccer is a big deal. And this was really the biggest symbol of Brazil for British people. It was soccer. Then there was samba and carnival, and Rio de Janeiro had that sort of frisson of licentiousness that one could go to Rio, and what happens in Rio stays in Rio. So this was all a very sort of narrow perception of Brazil, which is encapsulated, I think, in that fantastic song from the 1960s, The Girl from Ipanema. And when I got to Brazil, I realized that this was nothing to do with the reality of what is a quite remarkable country. It's absolutely enormous. That's the first thing that strikes you when you go there. It has a population of 200 million people, and it stretches from way beyond the equator down close towards the territories of Antarctica. It's a phenomenal country with natural resources that no other territory in the world can boast. It has everything in agricultural terms. It's the biggest exporter of coffee in the world. It's the biggest exporter of orange juice. It's the biggest exporter of beef. It's the biggest exporter of soya. It has proven iron ore reserves which can satisfy global needs for over 200 years. The seventh largest economy in the world, bigger than India, bigger than Australia, bigger than Canada. And yet, nobody really has heard of Brazil within that context. And of course, it is home to the mighty Amazon, which is important for all of us. And so I began to wonder, how is it that this extraordinary country, this incredible country, really is unable to project its importance, its vitality, and its diversity to the rest of the world? What is it about Brazil that disables it from projecting itself to the rest of the world? And so I thought it would be very interesting, just before I visited Brazil for the first time, to have a look on Amazon to see what sort of books there were on Brazil. And I did the same with other countries that I visited, China, for example, and India. And if you put in the rise of China or the new China in Amazon, you will see hundreds of books coming through on Amazon about the great drama of China over the past 30 years. If you do the same on India, you'll see dozens of books about India's great transformation since 1990. And if you put the same search criteria in for Brazil, you'll come up with about 4 or 5 books at most, and all pretty much of the same genre. It's sort of Brazil, land of contrasts. And I went there for the first time, and I couldn't believe how many extraordinary stories there were in this country. So I said at the time, 10 years ago, I thought one day I would like to come back and write a book about Brazil. And a few years later, there's a slight element of cynicism here, after Brazil had been awarded the World Cup finals for 2014 and the Olympic Games for this year, 2016, which are scheduled to be held in Rio, I thought, well, if you're going to write a book about Brazil, write it sort of now, because it's the only time that anyone's going to be interested in Brazil, because clearly, for some reason, people aren't interested in Brazil. This is a country locked in by its stereotypes, and these 2 mega sporting events were a real opportunity to try and break the chains of those stereotypes. So I then had to wonder what I was going to write about, and what I thought is the way to get through is to find a story, a really gripping story, which people will want to follow on its own merits, but will then slowly begin to explain to people why this country is so fascinating. And the question that I wanted to answer is why Brazil remains so unknown and isn't able to use these extraordinary resources it has to advertise itself around the world. I mean, this is a country that in 2030 will be the 4th or 3rd largest economy in the world, and yet politically it has no purchase whatsoever anywhere, really, given its size. So that was the question I was trying to answer. And I was trying to find what is the story that I need to tell this and try and explain this, and indeed try and understand it myself. And I was in Rio in November 2013 and watching television, and all of a sudden the schedules on the television programs in Brazil were completely cleared. And everyone went over to live broadcasting the arrest of a single man. It was very much like the experience for Brazilians of what happened here in the United States when O.J. Simpson was being arrested, and the helicopters of the police and the television cameras were following the Ford van as it went down the freeway in California. And this was the same thing in the middle of Rio, right in the middle of some of the most fancy tourist areas of Rio, by the lake in the center of what's called the South Zone. And what we saw was a car, and there were 3 sets of policemen surrounding this car. And this was the interesting thing for me, as a man was dragged out from the trunk of the car and hauled up in front of the cameras for everyone to see, and everyone was taking his photograph, is that the 3 police agencies around this car were competing to arrest this man, competing so much that members of 2 of the police forces actually drew their weapons at each other in order to claim the arrest of this man. And this man was a man called Nem of Rocinha, or Nem of Rocinha, or Nem da Rocinha. And his real name is Antonio Francisco Bonfim Lopes. And I was just so fascinated by this scene that the next day I started to do a little bit of research on Nem, who he was, and why he had inspired such drama on the streets of Rio. And it turns out that he had, for 5 years, been the so-called king of the hill of Rocinha, which is a slum. It's not just the largest slum in Rio, it's the largest slum in Brazil, and indeed many people claim it is the largest slum or favela in the whole of Latin America. And you have 120,000 odd people squeezed into the size of what in the United Kingdom would be a small little village, and running up a hill just by the Atlantic Ocean. But surrounding it are 3 of the wealthiest, richest districts in the whole of Brazil, in the whole of South America, because believe you me, when Brazilians are rich, they are really, really rich. And so you have this extraordinary juxtaposition of desperate poverty and overcrowding and slum conditions next to fabulous apartments and swimming pools and whatever it is you want. They're there. And I thought, well, this in many ways sums up the problems of Brazil, that you have very rich and you have very poor. But why was it, I asked myself, that Nem of Rocinha had managed to control this community of some 120,000 people for 5 years? How did he do that? He wasn't 36 when he was arrested. So what had he done? How had he achieved it? And to be in control of a favela, the drugs lord, because that's what he was, of a favela for 5 years, well, that was something of a record, because most people last about 18 months, 2 years before they decide to retire or before they're taken out by rivals. So this was really quite a remarkable character. And not only that, on researching it, I discovered that until the age of 25, Antonio Bonfim Lopes had been a respectable citizen. He'd had nothing to do with the drugs trade at all. And in fact, he had worked very industriously as a member of a team that distributed the Brazilian equivalent of TV Guide over the wealthier middle-class areas, around the wealthier middle-class areas of Rio. And he had actually refused to have anything to do with the drugs trade. And then when he was aged 25, his 10-month-old daughter, he had been born and brought up in Rocinha in exceptional poverty. His 10-month-old daughter, Eduarda, developed a rare and very, very nasty autoimmune disease called histiocytosis X, or Langerhans cell histiocytosis. And for many months, they had no idea what little Eduarda had developed. And then when they finally found out after about 10 months and the girl was dying, it turned out that they had to import expensive equipment from the United States in order to treat her. And Antonio and his young wife, Vanessa, couldn't afford that treatment. And because they came from a favela, from a slum, they couldn't borrow it from a bank because no bank would lend money to inhabitants of a slum. And so he borrowed the money from the only person who he knew would be able to lend it to him. And that was the then head of the drugs cartel in Hosinia, who lent him the $5,000 at the time. And Antonio said to him, look, there's no way I can pay you back this money. The only way I can do it is if I come and work for you. And the head of the drugs cartel said, okay, here's a gun, go down to the bottom of the favela and you'll work as a lookout. And because he was naturally very smart, he had only gone to school until the age of 11, but he had worked very well in his business, distributing magazines. He was a junior manager there. He went up the hierarchy of the drugs trade very quickly because he was a good organizer. He understood how the business worked. And then in 2004, in Easter 2004, there was a very dramatic event in Rosinia, the favela, when another drugs cartel launched an invasion because Rosinia was so successful as a hub for cocaine, launched an invasion, and during this invasion, Antonio's boss was killed by the police. And when you take out the kingpin in a drugs operation, wherever you are, then you have months and months of fighting between the various people below the boss, and that is what happened. You had effectively in Rosinia a low-level civil war for 18 months until Antonio came out on top as the new king of the hill, the new head of the favela drugs regime. And that's when his 5-year reign started. So I wanted to have a look at this and understand why this had happened, in Brazil. A lot of people think that Central and South American cultures are in some way inherently violent and prone to gang cultures and things like this. But when I started researching about the history of the favelas and violence and organized crime, I came across one very striking statistic. And that was that in 1982, the homicide rate in Rio de Janeiro was exactly the same as the homicide rate in New York City at the same time in 1982, 21.9 deaths per 100,000 of population. That's 1982. 1989, the homicide rate in New York has gone down by a point or two to about 20.8, 20.9 per 100,000 per capita. But in Rio de Janeiro, in that same 7-year period, the homicide rate has gone up to 69 per 100,000. That's more than 3 times what it was in 1982. So what accounted for that extraordinary surge in violence? Well, what accounted for it was that the Colombian drugs cartel, the Escobars of this world, the Cali cartel and everything, they had been pumping cocaine into the United States, which had embraced the culture of cocaine in the 70s and early 80s with gusto. But even the Americans, with their commitment to taking cocaine, couldn't hoover up everything, couldn't suck up everything that the Colombians were producing. Because although the United States has only 5% of the global population, it has 40% of the global cocaine consumption. But the Colombians found that they had all this cocaine that they couldn't get rid of into Miami here, into New York and Los Angeles, which were the 3 major hubs for cocaine distribution in the United States. And so they said, we need to think of new markets. They were good capitalists, the drug cartels. And they looked over the Atlantic Ocean and they saw Europe, and they thought, well, Europe would be perfect to sell cocaine into. And my word, they were right. The Europeans were ripe for the consumption of cocaine in large amounts. The problem is, of course, that between Colombia and Europe lies the said Atlantic Ocean and Brazil. And so Brazil became the transit country for huge amounts of cocaine coming from Colombia and over to Europe. And whenever a country becomes a transit zone for narcotics, it very quickly develops its own habit as well. And Rio de Janeiro, with its reputation for being a party city, was the perfect place for this new business of cocaine. In fact, this present day, Brazil is now the second largest consumer of cocaine in the world after the United States. And it started in the 1980s. And of course, the favelas, which had always had a sort of air of criminality and were the center of bank robbers and muggers and people who played the equivalent, the Brazilian equivalent of the numbers game, an animal lottery called Jogo do Bicho. These were the perfect hubs for distributing cocaine around the cities. The customers for the cocaine tended to be young middle-class people. And this is why Rocinha was in a perfect position to become the most powerful hub for cocaine distribution in Rio, because it was surrounded by three of the richest areas, middle-class residential areas. And here was something that was fascinating that separated Rio from the rest of Brazil because of its topography. Because in a place like São Paulo, which is largely flat, you have the middle-class residential areas in the center of the city, and then the favelas, the slums, tend to be on the periphery. But in Rio, it was different, because when the Portuguese colonized Rio, like everyone else who's since lived in Brazil, they preferred to stay on the beaches, on the coast. And that's been the case to this present day. 90% of Brazilians live on the coastal areas. But Rio has lots of hills in it. And the Portuguese colonists couldn't be bothered to go and build their houses on the hills, because they would have had to walk up them to get there. So when Rio started industrializing in the 1930s, and you got lots of people coming down from the poor areas of Brazil in the northeast, they started building their houses on the hills. So although the word favela originates, meaning a slum, in Rio, and everywhere in Brazil they call slums favelas, actually in Rio they have another word for it. When they refer to a slum, they refer to the hill. And so they differentiate between people who live on the hill and people who live on the asphalt or tarmac or asfalto. So what that meant is that unlike anywhere else in Brazil, the slums were right in the middle of the rich areas. And that's true to this very day. And there was another consequence of Rio having this very fractured topography. And that is, unlike in a city like São Paulo, where you got one huge criminal organization called the PCC, which distributed its drugs all around São Paulo, in Rio, each hill was its own little unit, its own sort of patriotic territory. And there you got three big criminal organizations emerge as a consequence. And each hill or slum would belong to one of the three organizations. And during the 1990s, this turned Rio de Janeiro into an inferno, into an absolute hell of drug-driven violence. And so the city started to go in steep decline. Tourists stayed away. Whole sectors of industry left Rio. The banking industry went to São Paulo. And this great monument of Brazilian identity and its music and its sort of passionate population were in a state of really in phenomenal decline, and nobody knew what to do about Rio. And when Antonio Bonfim Lopes became boss of Rocinha, What he discovered, because he was naturally quite a relatively pacific person, he ran this favela because he had 120 men under arms, because the cocaine trade in the 1980s had given huge sums of money to those who were running it, and they were very, very heavily armed with semi-automatic weapons, with rocket-propelled grenades, with all manner of things, so that they could control their territories and keep the police. They could confront the police and win when it came to controlling their territories. What he discovered is that if you brought the level of violence down, if you tried to reduce violence, and instead you shored up your power base by corrupting the police who surrounded your favela or your slum, and you also curried favor with the local population by creating what was effectively an embryonic welfare state system for his favela, which he did, then suddenly you would become quite a popular place, because people would say, well, there's not so much violence in Rio, so we can go and buy in Rocinha, so we can go and buy our cocaine there without any problems at all. And within 5 or 6 years, Rocinha had become this fabulously attractive place. It was the favela that tourists began to visit under Nem of Rocinha. It was the place that the entire Brazilian national soccer team went to party, where pop stars went to give concerts, where Hollywood stars indeed visited and met Nem of Rocinha as the big man. Ja Rule, a big rap star from New York, went and played in Rocinha. And Nem of Rocinha understood that if you bring down levels of violence, your business goes up. And that's why this place became so powerful. A remarkable set of events after the year 2000 led to Antonio being arrested just over a year later in November, as I said, 2011. Now, I'm not going to deny you the unalloyed pleasure that you will have from reading the curious set of events that led to his arrests in 2011, but it really is quite a remarkable story, both political, social, and really it's like it's a bit like a thriller. But after I decided that Antonio was the story that I would like to focus on to try and understand why Brazil is unable to project itself in the outside world because really of its inequality and the vast inequality between its elite and its poor people. That's really the key to the problems that Brazil faces. I wrote to Nem of Rocinha at his maximum security prison in the interior of Brazil, and I said, this is who I am, can I come and see you? And to my great surprise, he said yes. And so I spent 10 meetings with him, 28 hours, interviewing him about his entire life and about how the drugs business worked, how a man aged 26 years old or 27, 29, when he becomes boss of Rocinha, how he runs a city of 100 to 120,000 people, not only as the biggest entrepreneur in the city, but also as the prime minister of this place. It was a really extraordinary story. And after that, because his words were not sufficient for me to write the story, I went to the police, who spent 4 years investigating him. I spoke to politicians, I spoke to his enemies, his family, his friends. And the story that has emerged from that, which I've now produced as this book, is really, it's quite flabbergasting. It's an extraordinary story, and I think it says a lot about Brazil and how, if Brazil is ever able to overcome these issues and problems that it has, it will be a truly remarkable and powerful and influential country. But we could be a long time from that. A big test is going to be the Olympics this year, particularly now that they have Zika virus that they're having to deal with, which you may have read about, which really for Brazil is the icing on the cake, because it is suffering at the moment a monumental political, constitutional, and economic crisis, underpinned by what I believe to be the largest corruption scandal in history surrounding the state oil or parastate oil company of Petrobras. So there are immense challenges, but it remains one of the most fascinating, diverse, and potentially powerful countries in the whole world. And I hope through this book you'll be able to get to know a bit about it. Thank you very much. And of course, if there are any questions, I'm perfectly happy to answer them.
Time for questions.
You said when you first began to talk about Brazil, you said your initial topic, what you wanted to look into, was the connection between globalization and the globalization of organized crime. Were there other insights you had about that, not necessarily that pertain to Brazil, but to other places?
Oh, well, certainly. I mean, what I did when I visited all these various countries to see how organized crime was globalizing, I would say, in a nutshell, there are two events which led to the rapid globalization of transnational crime. The first is the Big Bang that Reagan and Thatcher inaugurated in 1986, i.e. the liberation of capital markets around the world, so that money could suddenly move into territories that it had never been in before, and which had very weak regulatory regimes about where is the boundary between criminal and sort of Wild West style entrepreneurial activity. That was the first thing. And then the second thing was the collapse of communism in 1989, which resulted in the emergence of a huge lawless territory from Slovenia in the west of the former Yugoslavia to the Chinese border, because when the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe had their revolutions, the state collapsed at the same time as the planned economies of the communist period turned into market economies. And because the state was collapsing, it was entirely unable to police this new economic realities. And so the people who emerged as the arbiters of business disputes in Eastern Europe were groups that what sociologists like to call privatized law enforcement agencies, and what we prefer to call more casually the mafia. And so you got a huge mafia structure building up in large parts of Eastern Europe. And they soon discovered that not only could they police markets that other people were engaged in terms of business, but they could create their own markets. And for them, it didn't matter whether they were dealing in caviar from the Caspian, or whether they were dealing in drugs coming in from Colombia, or whether they were dealing with food distribution around the former Soviet Union. Indeed, one of the big Bulgarian mafia bosses who I interviewed for my book on global organized crime, McMafia, he said to me, he said, look, if it wasn't for us, nobody would have had any food on the table because nothing was working. So this was not an entirely sort of pernicious phenomenon. It was what happens when you suddenly introduce capitalism in societies which don't have the institutions to deal with it. And so those two phenomena together, you remember around 1990, China started opening up its markets. India started opening up its markets. 1994, you have the first elections in South Africa, and all sorts of people come into South Africa. Brazil, too, which was a very, very quite an enclosed market, it too started opening up its markets. And so this was a tremendous opportunity for organized crime to exploit, and it did it with gusto. And of course, had sufficient resources to corrupt politicians and institutions along the way. And that's a very, very significant aspect to the whole thing.
Example of that, right?
I think so. I mean, gangster capitalism is how we define the capitalism of the former Soviet Union of the 1990s, and I can't think of a better etiquette for it. It's entirely appropriate.
Did you ever find any explicit connections between criminal bosses at the favela level and corrupt officials? Was there interchange there?
Had I had another year living in Rio, I would have nailed it. I know what some of those connections are, but I would have needed documentary evidence to do it. And I simply didn't have, when I was writing this book, I was going backwards and forwards between London and Rio and other parts of Brazil, which was frankly exhausting. I lived in the favela for 3 months myself. It was not easy. I was living in a room the size of a prison cell, and there's no air conditioning. When it rains, everything comes down. It's biblical downfalls in downpours in Rio. The sewage, it's an open sewage system, so when it rains, the sewage all comes up. The noise is incessant. People are arguing, dogs are barking. There are exchanges of gunfire. There are fireworks going off every time one of the 4 Rio teams scores a goal. And there are the funk parties going on the whole time. I literally, for 3 months, didn't get a single night's uninterrupted sleep. And I felt I had to do this to try and understand and experience what it was for people to live like this on a day-to-day basis. And the other thing I felt that I had to do was to learn Portuguese, which at my age, believe you me, even though I speak other languages, I am becoming old and tired and sick and stupid, and it was really hard work. But we kind of half got there. I can certainly read it very fluently, which was useful. But it was, when I look back on it, a really extraordinary experience, the whole thing. And in retrospect, I wouldn't have missed it for anything. But I do regret that what I would really like to do is I would like to demonstrate how leading politicians actually do take money from the drugs trade at the favelas in Rio. But for that, if you're going to publish that sort of stuff, you have to be absolutely spot on with your facts, and you have to be able to show the documentation or have the testimony of people who are prepared to stand up in court and say it.
Those people won't live long.
Well, precisely. So,
No, I was just wondering where Brasilia fit in this picture. We don't hear anything about it here.
about Brasilia, the capital.
Yes. Is it a functioning as a capital?
Well, it's actually an interesting question. One of the reasons why Brazil has a lot of problems is that when it's... So if you look at the map of South America, it's absolutely fascinating because you have this one huge country and then you have lots of other countries. And the lots of other countries, they all speak Spanish. And this one huge country speaks Portuguese. When people try and define what is it that is so Brazilian about Brazil, what is it about Brazil? Is it the football? Is it the samba? Is it the Amazon or whatever? No, it is the Portuguese language. That is what keeps Brazil together. When independence came to South America in the 19th century, there were a lot of disputes between the local elites of the Spanish-speaking areas, and they resulted in that fragmentation, which created Chile, Colombia, Argentina, Venezuela, and so on and so forth. But in Brazil, the people who inaugurated independence was the royal imperial family itself. And this turned out to be a very shrewd move because they were able to persuade the local potentates that it would be good to have a central figure who would bestow privileges upon the regional elites. It didn't always entirely work. Uruguay was once part of Brazil, and that left, and São Paulo is often straining to leave Brazil, but that's another story. But it maintained its coherence, but it maintained its coherence at the expense of any real authority from central government. So there are three layers of government in Brazil now: the federal government in Brasilia, the state governments, which are very powerful in the 26 states, and then there's the 27th. It's like Washington, D.C., the federal district in Brasilia. And then you have the municipal governments all over as well. And if you want to push through a meaningful policy in, say, Rio de Janeiro, you have to have agreement between Brasilia, between the state governor, and between the municipal government. And that very, very rarely happens. And so you often have stasis in government, stagnation, where nothing gets done. And we are really seeing that now during the current crisis in Brazil, is that there is such infighting going on between the various political instances that the crisis is getting worse and worse and worse, and it's partly because of that.
Do you believe that's the reason that Brazil can't project a political power commensurate to its economic power?
It is one of the reasons why it can't. It's absolutely one of the reasons why it can't. And it has to overcome this. I mean, related to that is the nature of political parties and the relationship of political parties to the Congress and the federal government, because political parties, on the whole, with one or two very obvious exceptions, but on the whole, you can have undue influence with a very small political party in Congress that is actually not representing a definable constituency. It is a vehicle for the personal enrichment of the person who's running and organized that political party, who has a network of local patronage that has allowed him or her to get to Congress, and it's deeply, deeply corrupt. There's almost a sort of, funnily enough, in a peculiar way, an absence of ideology in the Brazilian system. So.
You mentioned how there's not that many books published about Brazil, so thank you for writing this one. But I'm curious if, while you were researching, you found some great books that tell great stories about Brazil.
Oh, well, in Portuguese itself, there are fantastic books. Brazil, really, in the past 15 years has had, I mean, it has a very strong literary tradition anyhow, going back to the end of the 19th century, and particularly from the 1930s onwards. But you know, it suffers tremendously from being a language that is not terribly well known in other parts of the world, because it has one of the most thriving indigenous publishing industries I've ever come across. And for me, writing a book primarily, although this book is going to be published in Brazil, and I'm sort of bracing myself for that experience, for me, there's so much written material to draw on. And one thing that I didn't mention about Brazilian history, which is incredibly important, and this really, there's a real important point to this, is that during the period of the slave trade, the 300 years or so of the slave trade, 500,000 slaves were brought over to the United States. 500,000. Everything we understand about the slave trade, I think, largely we get through Hollywood and through North American literature or Caribbean literature and British literature. During that same period, Brazil imported 5 million slaves, 10 times as many as were imported into the United States. But what do we know about the experience of slavery in Brazil? We know nothing. And yet, in terms of Brazil's social structure today, it's enormously important. This is the largest African country outside of Nigeria, beyond Nigeria. There are more people who are African descendants in Brazil than anywhere else apart from Nigeria. It's absolutely fundamental to that issue of inequality as well, because although you never had institutionalized discrimination like segregation or apartheid, economically, if you are born black in Brazil, the chances of you accessing any of this immense wealth that this country has is extremely, extremely small. And you can imagine, I mean, you know, how much cultural product there has been because of slavery here in the United States. Well, in Brazil, there's a lot there in Portuguese, but it never gets translated. No one outside of Brazil ever looks at it, and even quite a lot of people in Brazil don't look at it either.
Cotton production, what was
Sugar, wood, and then diamonds, then coffee, then rubber, you name it. Brazil has everything, and the slaves worked it all. So there you go.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Misha.
Thank you very much for coming. And of course, if you want to hear the thrilling inside story of Nem, I will sign copies of the book for you. Call me old-fashioned.
All right, folks, so a note to our internet audience watching at home, there's still plenty of time to call the number on your screen, and we can get a copy of Nemesis shipped to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the book as well as several of Mr. Glenny's previous titles for sale at the counter in the front room over there. As he said, he'll be signing here at the table to the left of the podium. And this has been great. Please give another hand to Misha Glenny. Thanks very much. Thank you.